The radio crackles with controlled panic, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. All stations, perimeter breach sector 4, multiple hostiles inside the wire. Repeat, we have enemy combatants inside the compound. All personnel to defensive positions. Specialist Clarissa Evans looks up from the medical supply inventory she's been conducting in the aid station. Her hands pause over the boxes of bandages and IV bags. Outside, the sharp crack of rifle fire erupts, followed by the deeper thump of grenades detonating. The forward operating base in Afghanistan's Kunar province has been her home for 3 months. She's treated everything from combat wounds to food poisoning, worked 18-hour shifts during mass casualty events, and earned respect from the infantry and special forces troops who rotate through her clinic. But she's never had to fight. She's a medic. Her job is saving lives, not taking them. The M4 carbine propped in the corner of the aid station is just a requirement, something she qualified with during basic training but hasn't fired since arriving in country. That's about to change, because 50 enemy fighters just breached the perimeter using an explosive-formed penetrator to blow through the concrete wall, and they're advancing toward the base's interior with a plan to overrun the position before reinforcements can arrive. The infantry platoons that normally defend the FOB are out on patrol. The quick reaction force is pinned down at the main gate. The mortar pit is being overrun, and Clarissa's aid station, filled with 4 wounded soldiers too injured to fight and 2 other medics who've never been in direct combat, is directly in the path of the enemy assault. 3 months ago, the male infantry soldiers made jokes about having a female medic, saying she'd probably panic under fire, that women couldn't handle the stress of combat medicine, that she was only there because of political correctness. They're about to learn that the medic who spent the last 90 days keeping them alive is also the most dangerous person at the FOB when someone threatens her patients. Before we show you how one field medic with an M4 carbine became the last line of defense for an entire medical facility under assault, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and hit subscribe. Because what happened during the next 45 minutes proved that sometimes the person who saves lives is also the one who will take them, when she has no other choice and everything she cares about is on the line. Specialist Clarissa Evans had never planned on joining the Army. She'd been 2 years into a nursing program at Arizona State when her father, a retired Marine Corps corpsman, suffered a massive heart attack and died, leaving her mother with medical bills that consumed their savings. The Army offered student loan repayment and training as a 68W combat medic. She'd signed up thinking she'd serve 4 years, get her education paid for, and transition to civilian nursing. That was 3 years ago. She'd discovered she was good at emergency medicine. Really good. The chaos of trauma care, the split-second decisions, the pressure of keeping someone alive despite catastrophic injuries. She thrived in that environment in ways that surprised her instructors. By the time she deployed to Afghanistan, she'd earned her expert field medical badge, a qualification that less than 20% of medics achieve, and had been handpicked for assignment to a forward operating base that supported both conventional infantry and special forces operations. FOB Wilderness was a small position in Kunar province, nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains that provided enemy fighters with excellent observation and firing positions. The base held about 120 personnel on any given day, a rotating mix of infantry platoons conducting patrols, special forces teams running missions, logistics personnel keeping supplies flowing, and Clarissa's small medical section treating the inevitable casualties that came from operating in one of Afghanistan's most contested areas. The base defenses consisted of concrete barriers, guard towers, concertina wire, and a small quick reaction force that could respond to attacks. But the real security came from the infantry platoon's aggressive patrolling that kept enemy fighters off balance. Tonight, 3 of those 4 infantry platoons were outside the wire on different operations. The 4th was resting after a grueling 3-day mission. The QRF was at minimum manning, and the enemy had been watching, waiting for exactly this moment. Clarissa was in the aid station conducting the nightly inventory, a tedious but necessary task that ensured they'd have critical supplies for the next mass casualty event. Her 2 fellow medics, specialists Chen and Rodriguez, were in the sleeping area catching a few hours of rest before the morning sick call. In the 4-bed patient ward, 4 soldiers were recovering from various injuries. Sergeant Barrett with a broken ankle from a vehicle rollover, Private First Class Hawkins with a severe infection requiring IV antibiotics, Corporal Myers still recovering from a gunshot wound to the shoulder, and Lieutenant Vance who'd taken shrapnel from an IED blast 3 days ago. None of them were in any condition to fight. The radio transmission of perimeter breach changed everything in an instant. Clarissa's training kicked in automatically. She moved to the ward, already calling out orders. "Chen, Rodriguez, get out here now. We have a breach." She started pulling the 4 patients out of their beds despite their injuries. "Barrett, can you move?" "With crutches, yeah." "Then you're ambulatory. Get to the bunker. Hawkins, disconnect your IV. I'll restart it later if we survive. Myers, your arm is going to hurt like hell, but you can shoot left-handed if you have to. Vance, you're barely conscious, so you get carried." Chen and Rodriguez stumbled out of the sleeping area, pulling on their gear. Both were young, green, and had never been in direct combat. They looked to Clarissa for guidance. "Help me get these patients to the bunker, then we establish a defensive perimeter around the aid station. If enemy fighters breach into this compound, they'll execute wounded Americans. That's not happening while I'm breathing." Outside, the volume of fire was increasing. She could hear the distinct crack of AK-47s mixing with the heavier bark of American M4s and M240 machine guns. Grenades thumped in rapid succession. Someone was screaming for a medic over the radio, but the tactical frequency was so chaotic she couldn't determine where. They got the 4 patients into the reinforced bunker behind the aid station, basically a concrete room designed to protect people during rocket attacks. Barrett hobbled in on crutches, Hawkins moved under his own power, though he looked ready to collapse, and Chen and Rodriguez carried Vance between them, while Myers stumbled along clutching his shoulder. "Stay here," Clarissa ordered. "Don't open this door for anyone except us. If enemy fighters breach, they'll be speaking Pashto or Dari. You'll know." She closed the heavy steel door and secured it from outside, then turned to Chen and Rodriguez. Both looked terrified. "Okay, defensive positions. Chen, you take the left side of the compound with fields of fire toward the motor pool. Rodriguez, right side covering the supply depot approach. I'll take center with coverage of the main avenue of approach from the perimeter breach." "What if they get close?" Rodriguez asked, his voice shaking. "Then we shoot them. Rules of engagement are simple. Anyone not in American uniform who's inside our wire is hostile. No questions, no hesitation. You see a threat, you engage." They moved to their positions. Clarissa grabbed her M4 carbine from the aid station, checked that a magazine was seated, and pulled the charging handle to chamber a round. The weapon felt heavier than she remembered from qualification range. She'd fired expert marksman during basic training and had re-qualified annually, but she'd never engaged a human target. Never had to make the decision to take a life. Everything in her training as a medic, every instinct she'd developed, was about preserving life. But the alternative was letting enemy fighters slaughter wounded men who couldn't defend themselves. She settled into a firing position behind a concrete barrier that gave her cover and a clear view of the main pathway that led from the perimeter breach toward the interior of the base. The darkness was profound. It was 3:30 hours, the moon was down, and the base lighting had been shot out during the initial assault. She pulled her night vision device down over her right eye, and the world shifted into shades of green. Through the nods, she could see the fighting at the far end of the base. Muzzle flashes, figures moving, smoke from grenades creating obscuring clouds. And she could see enemy fighters advancing toward her position. They were moving in fire teams, using proper tactical spacing and covering each other's movement. These weren't poorly trained insurgents. This was a coordinated assault by fighters who knew what they were doing. The radio crackled with fragmented transmissions. "Section under heavy fire. We need. Breach at Sector 4 is expanded. Estimate 30 hostiles inside the. QRF is pinned at the gate. Cannot maneuver to. Casualties mounting. Where the hell is medical?" Clarissa keyed her radio. "Any station? This is aid station. We have 4 patients secure and are establishing defensive perimeter. Cannot provide medical support while under direct assault. Will advise when situation changes." A voice she recognized as the FOB commander came back. "Aid station. Be advised, enemy assault force is moving toward interior positions. You may have to defend in place. Reinforcements inbound, but ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. An eternity in combat. Through her night vision, she watched the first group of enemy fighters approach her position. 4 men moving tactically, weapons up, clearly searching for targets. They were 200 meters out, moving between buildings, using cover effectively. Clarissa's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were steady. Years of emergency medicine had trained her to function under pressure. But this was different. This was making the conscious decision to end lives rather than save them. The enemy fighters continued advancing. 150 meters, 100 meters. She could engage now. Her M4 was effective at this range. But she waited. Better to let them close distance, improve her hit probability, make every round count. 75 meters. Close enough. Clarissa settled her rifle sights on the lead fighter, controlled her breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The M4 cracked, the recoil familiar from hundreds of training repetitions. Through her night vision, she saw the fighter drop. No time to think about what she'd just done. The other 3 were reacting, diving for cover, returning fire. Rounds snapped past her position, impacting the concrete barrier with sharp cracks. Clarissa engaged the second target, firing controlled pairs. 2 shots, assess, 2 shots. The fighter went down. The remaining 2 had found cover behind a sandbag position. They were firing at her muzzle flash, but the concrete barrier was solid, and their rounds weren't penetrating. She transitioned to the third target, waiting for him to expose himself to fire. Patient, controlled, when his head and shoulders came up, she fired 1 shot to the head. He dropped and didn't move. The fourth fighter broke and ran, clearly rattled by watching 3 teammates go down in under 30 seconds. Clarissa tracked him through her night vision, leading his movement, and fired. He stumbled and fell, crawled a few feet, then stopped moving. 4 enemy fighters neutralized in less than a minute. Clarissa's hands were shaking now, adrenaline dumping into her system as the reality of what she'd just done hit her. She'd killed 4 people, 4 human beings who 30 seconds ago had been alive and now weren't. But there was no time to process that. More fighters were advancing, and the radio was reporting that the enemy was pushing deeper into the FOB. The next wave came from a different angle. 6 fighters trying to flank her position using the shadows between buildings. But Clarissa had seen them through her night vision and had repositioned to cover the new approach. She engaged from a different angle, catching them in the open. Her M4 fired in controlled bursts, the semi-automatic action allowing rapid but precise shooting. 2 fighters went down in the first 3 seconds. The others scattered, trying to find cover, but she was already tracking them. Third target engaged and hit. Fourth target moving erratically, but she led him, fired, saw him drop. Fifth target took cover behind a water trailer, but exposed himself when he returned fire. She put 2 rounds through the cover, and he didn't shoot again. The 6th fighter was smarter. He'd gone to ground and wasn't moving, probably hoping she'd lost track of him. But through night vision, she could see the heat signature of his body against the cooler ground. She waited. Patient. Eventually, he shifted position slightly, trying to get a better angle. She fired first. He didn't fire back. 10 enemy fighters down. 10 lives ended by someone who'd spent her entire military career dedicated to saving lives. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, but Clarissa pushed it aside. She could process the psychological implications later, if there was a later. Right now, wounded soldiers were depending on her to keep enemy fighters away from the aid station. "Chen, Rodriguez, sit rep," she called into her radio. "Chen here, no contact my side yet." "Rodriguez, I see movement near the supply depot but can't get a clear shot." "Copy, shifting to support Rodriguez." Clarissa moved from her position, using the buildings for cover, approaching Rodriguez's location from an angle that would give her better fields of fire. Through her night vision, she could see what Rodriguez had spotted, a group of 8 to 10 enemy fighters consolidating near the supply depot, clearly planning their next move. They were in a covered position that Rodriguez couldn't engage effectively. But Clarissa had an angle. She settled into a supported firing position, using a concrete barrier to steady her rifle. 8 targets, 30 rounds remaining in her magazine. She did the math. If she maintained fire discipline and didn't miss, she had enough ammunition. She engaged the furthest target first, working backward toward the closest. The tactical logic was to prevent them from identifying where fire was coming from as long as possible. First shot, fighter down. The others didn't immediately react. Second shot. Another fighter dropped. Now they were reacting, looking around, trying to identify the threat. Third and fourth shots in rapid succession, 2 more down. The remaining fighters were scrambling, some returning fire but shooting at ghosts. They hadn't identified her position yet. 5th shot, 6th shot, 7th shot. The enemy formation was collapsing into chaos, fighters running in different directions, abandoning tactical discipline in their panic. 8th shot caught a fighter mid-sprint. 9th shot stopped another who'd been trying to organize a retreat. Her magazine ran dry. Clarissa dropped it, seated a fresh magazine, and chambered a round in under 3 seconds, muscle memory from thousands of repetitions and training taking over. The remaining 2 fighters had found cover and were suppressing her position with sustained fire. She couldn't raise her head without taking rounds. "Rodriguez, I'm pinned. Can you flank?" "Negative, they've got my position covered too." Clarissa pulled a fragmentation grenade from her vest. She'd never thrown one in combat, only in training. But the principle was simple. Time the fuse, throw it where enemies are hiding, wait for the explosion. She pulled the pin, released the spoon, counted to 2, and threw. The grenade arced through the darkness and landed behind the cover where the 2 fighters were positioned. The explosion was sharp and loud, echoing across the compound. When the smoke cleared, both fighters were down. 18 enemy fighters neutralized. Clarissa's ammunition was depleted to 3 magazines remaining, and the radio was reporting that another wave was pushing toward the interior positions. "Aid station, this is TOC. Enemy assault force has split into 3 elements. Estimate 0 to 15 hostiles heading toward your position from the eastern perimeter. Can you hold?" Clarissa assessed her situation. Chen and Rodriguez were still in position, but hadn't engaged enemies yet, meaning they had full ammunition loads. She had 3 magazines, 90 rounds. Against 15 fighters, that was theoretically sufficient if every shot counted. "Teuk, aid station copies. We will hold this position." Because there was no alternative, the wounded men in the bunker couldn't be moved. Retreating meant abandoning them, and Clarissa had spent 3 years becoming a medic specifically to save lives in impossible situations. This was just another impossible situation that required her to do whatever was necessary. The eastern approach to the aid station was more open than the previous assault routes, a long stretch of ground with limited cover, designed intentionally to create a kill zone against anyone trying to assault the medical facilities. Clarissa repositioned to take advantage of that tactical feature. She set up in a position that gave her excellent fields of fire across the entire approach, with Chen and Rodriguez covering the flanks to prevent enemy fighters from using the limited cover available. Through night vision, she watched the enemy force approach. They were moving more cautiously now, clearly aware that their previous assaults had been decimated. 15 fighters advancing in staggered formation, using whatever cover they could find. "Chen, Rodriguez, wait for my mark. We engage simultaneously on my command. Concentrate fire on the center of their formation and work outward." "Copy." "Roger." Clarissa let them advance into the kill zone. Closer, closer. At 75 meters, she gave the command. All elements, engage. 3 M4 carbines opened fire simultaneously. The effect was devastating. The enemy formation, caught in the open with minimal cover, took immediate casualties. Fighters dropped. Others dove for cover that wasn't adequate. Some tried to return fire but couldn't identify targets in the darkness. Clarissa fired controlled pairs, transitioning between targets with practiced efficiency. The M4's semi-automatic action allowed rapid engagement. Aim, fire twice, move to next target, fire twice, assess and repeat. She dropped 3 fighters in the first 5 seconds. Chen and Rodriguez were engaging effectively, their training overcoming their inexperience. The enemy formation was collapsing, fighters breaking and trying to retreat, but they were in the open with no covered route back. Clarissa's magazine ran dry. She executed a tactical reload, dropped the empty mag, seated a fresh one, charged the weapon, and resumed firing, all in under 4 seconds. The remaining enemy fighters, maybe 5 or 6 still combat effective, had consolidated behind a disabled vehicle and were returning organized fire. Their rounds were impacting close enough that Clarissa had to stay low. "Chen, can you flank left?" "Negative. I'd be completely exposed." The stalemate was broken by an unexpected source. Sergeant Barrett, the soldier with the broken ankle who was supposed to be in the bunker, appeared at Clarissa's position carrying an M203 grenade launcher he'd scrounged from somewhere. "I can hit that vehicle from here," he said, grimacing in pain but functional. "You're supposed to be in the bunker." "Fuck the bunker. We're all dying if we don't stop these assholes." Barrett aimed the M203, calculated the range, and fired. The 40mm grenade arced through the darkness and impacted directly behind the disabled vehicle where the enemy fighters were taking cover. The explosion was significantly larger than a hand grenade. When the smoke cleared, the enemy position was silent. Clarissa stared at Barrett. "You're going back on crutches after this." "Worth it." The radio crackled with new information. "All stations, QRF has broken through and is pushing enemy forces back toward the perimeter breach. Reinforcements from Camp Blessing are inbound. ETA 5 minutes. Enemy assault appears to be collapsing." The volume of fire across the FOB was decreasing. The sharp crack of rifles and thump of grenades was becoming sporadic rather than sustained. The enemy's coordinated assault was falling apart against resistance they hadn't expected. Clarissa lowered her weapon, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Her arms were shaking from sustained firing, her ears were ringing despite wearing ear protection, and the adrenaline that had been sustaining her was starting to crash. She'd fired approximately 120 rounds. She'd personally engaged and killed at least 20 enemy fighters, possibly more if the grenades and supporting fire had been effective. Chen and Rodriguez had accounted for several more. The aid station had held. The wounded soldiers were safe. The mission was accomplished. But the cost of that accomplishment was still processing in her mind. 20 human beings were dead because she'd made the decision to engage them with lethal force. 20 people who'd been alive 45 minutes ago and now weren't. The fact that they'd been enemy combatants trying to kill Americans didn't make the psychological weight any lighter. Clarissa was a medic. Her entire identity was built around saving lives. But tonight, she'd ended lives with clinical efficiency that surprised her. The sun was starting to rise, painting the eastern sky with red and orange. The FOB was a disaster, smoke rising from multiple buildings, fires burning, bodies scattered across the compound. Medical personnel from the reinforcement unit were arriving, along with fresh infantry to secure the position. Clarissa stood, weapon still in her hands, and surveyed the carnage. Chen and Rodriguez approached, both looking shell-shocked but functional. "We held," Chen said quietly. "We did," Clarissa confirmed. "Now let's get back to our actual job. We've got wounded to treat." Because that's what medics did. They saved lives. And if sometimes that required them to end other lives to protect the ones they were responsible for, then that was part of the job too. The after-action review happened 3 days later in the TIOC. Present were the FOB commander, Lieutenant Colonel Mason, the infantry company commander, Captain Rivera, and representatives from the investigation team sent from higher headquarters. The tactical display showed the enemy's assault plan, a coordinated 3-axis attack designed to overwhelm the FOB's reduced defensive posture. Intelligence suggested the enemy had been planning this operation for weeks, waiting for the right moment when multiple infantry platoons would be outside the wire. The enemy assault force consisted of approximately 50 fighters, Colonel Mason began. They achieved initial tactical surprise with the explosive breach and penetrated deep into the FOB. The attack was designed to overrun our position before reinforcements could arrive. He pulled up casualty figures. Final count, 3 U.S. personnel KIA, 11 WIA. Enemy, 42 confirmed KIA, 8 captured wounded. The room was quiet as those numbers sank in. Against a 50-person assault force with the element of surprise, the FOB had held with relatively light casualties. The decisive action that prevented catastrophic losses occurred at the aid station, Mason continued. He brought up tactical graphics showing the fighting around Clarissa's position. Specialist Evans and her two fellow medics engaged and eliminated 23 enemy fighters who were attempting to penetrate to the interior of the FOB and access the medical facilities where we had wounded personnel unable to defend themselves. He looked directly at Clarissa. Specialist Evans personally accounted for 20 confirmed enemy KIA and directed the defense that prevented enemy access to critical facilities. Her actions under fire demonstrated exceptional courage and tactical competence. Captain Rivera added, "I've reviewed the helmet cam footage and radio logs. Specialist Evans engaged enemy fighters at ranges from 5 to 100 meters, maintained fire discipline, conserved ammunition, and made tactical decisions that maximized defensive effectiveness. She performed at a level consistent with our most experienced infantry soldiers." The investigation officer spoke up. "Specialist Evans, can you walk us through your decision-making process during the engagement?" Clarissa considered her answer. "Sir, my primary responsibility was protecting wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. When enemy fighters breached the perimeter and advanced toward the aid station, I assessed that allowing them to reach our position would result in the execution of American casualties. That was unacceptable." "So you made the decision to engage with lethal force?" "Yes, sir. The enemy was inside our perimeter, armed, advancing with hostile intent toward a medical facility. Rules of engagement were clear." "You're trained as a combat medic, not an infantry soldier. Did you feel prepared for sustained direct combat?" "Sir, no one feels prepared for combat the first time. But I had the training, the weapons, and the tactical position to be effective, so I executed what needed to be done," Colonel Mason interrupted. "For the record, I'm recommending Specialist Evans for the Silver Star. Her actions saved American lives and prevented the enemy from achieving their operational objectives. This recommendation has been endorsed by everyone in the chain of command." Clarissa felt uncomfortable with the attention. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "No, Specialist. Your job is providing medical care. What you did was far beyond your job description. You performed as a combat soldier defending critical infrastructure while also ensuring your patients remained safe. That's extraordinary performance that deserves recognition." After the official review ended, Captain Rivera approached Clarissa privately. "How are you holding up?" Clarissa considered lying, saying she was fine, but decided on honesty. "Sir, I'm struggling. I became a medic to save lives. Last week I killed 20 people. Those two facts don't reconcile easily in my head." Rivera nodded. "I've been in combat for 3 deployments, killed more enemy fighters than I can remember. It never gets easy, and if it does, that's when you need to worry. The fact that it bothers you means you're still human. Does it get better? It gets different. You learn to live with it. You focus on the lives you saved, the 4 wounded soldiers who'd have been executed if enemy fighters reached them. The other Americans at the FOB who survived because you held that position. That's what you carry. And if that's not enough, then you talk to professionals. We have counselors, chaplains, peer support. Use them. There's no shame in processing trauma, and what you experienced was absolutely traumatic." Clarissa appreciated the honesty. She'd already scheduled time with the FOB's behavioral health officer, recognizing that trying to process this alone would be destructive. Over the next weeks, she returned to her normal duties as a medic, treating routine sick call, managing combat casualties when patrols took contact, conducting training for incoming personnel. The rhythm of medical work was comforting, familiar, a return to the identity she'd built over 3 years. But something had changed. The infantry soldiers who'd previously joked about having a female medic now treated her differently. Not as someone to protect, but as someone who'd proven herself in the most definitive way possible. When a new infantry platoon arrived at the FOB, their platoon sergeant briefed them on the base's recent history. He pointed at the aid station. "That's where Specialist Evans and 2 other medics held off 23 enemy fighters during the assault. Evans personally dropped 20 of them. She's a medic, but she's also proven she'll fight when the situation demands it. Show her the respect she's earned." The new soldiers looked at the small woman in medical scrubs with new understanding. This wasn't someone to underestimate or make assumptions about. This was a warrior who happened to specialize in saving lives but could end them when necessary. 6 months later, Clarissa was back in the United States, her deployment complete. She attended the award ceremony where Colonel Mason pinned the Silver Star on her uniform, the nation's third highest decoration for valor in combat. Her mother was there, crying with pride and relief that her daughter had survived. Fellow medics from her training class were there, stunned that someone they'd gone through school with had accomplished something that would be taught as a case study. The citation read in part, "Specialist Evans demonstrated exceptional courage under fire by organizing and leading the defense of critical medical facilities against overwhelming enemy forces. Her tactical decisions, superior marksmanship, and unwavering dedication to protecting wounded soldiers resulted in the elimination of 23 enemy combatants and prevented catastrophic loss of American lives. Her actions reflect great credit upon herself, the Medical Corps, and the United States Army." After the ceremony, a young female specialist approached her, someone just starting medic training. "Ma'am, I heard about what you did. I'm going to be a combat medic too, and everyone says women can't handle it, that it's too hard, too dangerous, too physically demanding." Clarissa looked at the young soldier and saw herself 3 years earlier, uncertain, questioning whether she belonged, wondering if the doubters were right. "Can I give you some advice?" "Please. Don't let other people's limitations define your capabilities. Train hard, learn your job, develop skills that become undeniable. And remember that being a medic means doing whatever's necessary to protect the soldiers you're responsible for. Sometimes that means saving lives. Sometimes it means taking lives to save others. Be prepared for both." Were you scared when you had to fight? Terrified? But fear doesn't matter when people need you. What matters is doing what needs to be done despite the fear. The young specialist nodded, absorbing that wisdom. She saluted, not required for someone of equal rank, but given as a gesture of respect, and walked away with new determination. Clarissa watched her go and thought about the previous 6 months. She'd gone to Afghanistan as a medic focused solely on saving lives. She'd come back having learned that sometimes protecting life required taking it. The dichotomy still troubled her. She still had dreams about the faces of enemy fighters in her night vision scope, still processed the psychological weight of having ended human lives, still attended counseling sessions to work through the trauma. But she also knew with absolute certainty that she'd do it again if the situation demanded. Because the alternative, allowing wounded soldiers to be executed while she had the means to prevent it, was unacceptable. She'd taken an oath to support and defend. She'd promised to care for the sick and injured. And when those two commitments came into conflict with enemy fighters threatening her patients, she'd proven that a medic with an M4 carbine and the determination to use it was just as dangerous as any infantry soldier. 23 enemy fighters had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. The 4 wounded soldiers who survived in that bunker, Barrett, Hawkins, Myers, and Vance, would carry that knowledge with them forever. Each of them wrote letters to Clarissa after they recovered, thanking her not just for the medical care she'd provided during their treatment, but for the protection she'd given them when they were most vulnerable. Barrett, in particular, included a note that read, "You saved my life twice, once when you set my ankle, and once when you made sure enemy fighters never reached that bunker." I'll never forget that. The psychological impact of that night rippled through Clarissa's life in ways both expected and surprising. She continued her counseling sessions, working through the trauma with a therapist who specialized in combat stress. The nightmares came less frequently as months passed, though they never completely disappeared. But she also discovered something unexpected, a deep pride in having protected those who couldn't protect themselves. That pride didn't erase the weight of having taken lives, but it provided context and meaning to actions that might otherwise have been unbearable. When she eventually transitioned out of active duty and returned to civilian nursing school, she carried with her a perspective that her classmates couldn't fully understand. She'd seen humanity at its worst and its best. She'd learned that caring for patients sometimes meant making impossible choices. And she'd proven to herself that when everything was on the line, she possessed reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known existed. And Clarissa herself would live with the understanding that being a warrior sometimes meant doing things that contradicted your fundamental nature, and doing them anyway, because lives depended on it. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to hear more powerful stories of brave women in uniform.